Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Andrea Dambra, but everyone calls me Andre. And certainly when I was at Geneva, I was known as Andre. I was also known by some choice nicknames, as you can imagine, often based on my ethnicity, which today would have got the perpetrator or the wag that made it up a referral to the Prevent program and me a referral to many hours of intense therapy. Perhaps the most curious of these nicknames was Dago Rod, which was based on two false premises. Firstly, I am of Italian, not Spanish descent, and secondly, I do not nor have I ever looked like Rod Stewart. But I owned that nickname, and I had it printed on a T-shirt, which I proudly wore of a Saturday morning down the Kingsway, and I turned many a head. Today, I'm going to tell you something of the Second World War experience of my father, Francesco D'Ambra. I will tell you how uh, an outpouring of memories, roughly typed in Italian, on some loose sheets of paper, was converted into a book in English. I wanted to dedicate my presentation to my history teacher at Geneva, Wyn Williams. He was a miserable sod who worked us like dogs, and there was more chance of getting a pound coin out of a cardie's purse than there was of getting compliments or praise from Wyn Williams. But when you did get it, it was all the more telling for it. Without him, I would not have got my A at A-level history, I would not have got my distinction at S-level history, and I certainly would not have got into university. And the rest, as they say, is history. Of course, he's not to be confused with Fat Wyn, the barman at the Griffin Bar, also known as the Sixth Form Annex, who was reputed to be Wyn Williams's twin brother who'd eaten all the pies. So, who was Francesco D'Ambra? Well, as I said, he was my father, and he's born on the island of Ischia in Naples Bay. Needless to say, it has a warm Mediterranean climate, and growing up, my father would not have experienced extremes of cold, nor indeed even snow. He had a Southern Italian strong sense of family. He uh, was also physically very strong and thought nothing of swimming to the next island just to pick grapes and lie on the beach and eat them. He was a proud man. He was um, he was a good seaman. He was also someone who could make strong connections with people, a trait my wife has assured me has not been passed down to me. By way of example, at the last old Dinavorian dinner I was at, someone who I knew at school, who was not really part of my social circle though, made the point of coming up to me and remembering my father to me. I could think of no occasion or reason when he would have met my father, but obviously he had, and my father had made such an impression upon him that he'd wished to remember him to me. I mention all these traits, features, and characteristics because, in one way or another, they would come into play, have a bearing, uh, have an impact on the horror that would be my father's war experience. Although this picture is taken in the 1950s, for me, it provides a visual representation, a metaphor, if you will, of my father's lifestyle growing up in Ischia. And I'd ask you to bear it in mind when I come later on to describe some of the scenes that my father endured during his wartime experience. As a matter of interest, my father is the man you can see there crouching, working the rope. Now, for some historical background. In 1940, Italy entered the war, in the Second World War, on the side of the Germans. Uh, Prior to that, Mussolini had already occupied Albania as part of his expansionist plans. My father was a naval gunner based at a place called Valona or Valles on the Albanian coast. My grandfather had been sent to Albania as some sort of civilian administrator, and he was based in Tirana. On the 8th of September 1943, Italy capitulated. It did not surrender, it simply gave up fighting. But it did this without any forewarning or planning for those on the ground. To make matters even more confusing, Mussolini, who had been placed in prison by the Italian government, was snatched from that prison by German paratroopers and set up in a puppet state in the north of Italy. Italians on the ground therefore found themselves being attacked by Germans, partisans, and other Italians. There were even some partisan groups who were pro-fascist. And it was into this cauldron of chaos that my father found himself flung in September 1943. If you were an Italian on the ground, you could literally be killed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This next slide gives you an idea of the geography of the area. And my father would be forcibly taken to many of the countries you can see there before the end of his wartime experience. Before I get into his story, I thought you might be interested in how the book came about and some translation issues, or one in particular translation issue that I had. In 1988, when my father retired, he decided to set down his war memoir. In his transcript, he mentioned something called rabbia represa, or repressed rage, from which he and his comrades suffered. And you get the impression when reading his transcript, with each strike on his Olivetti typewriter, he assuaged some of that repressed rage. It was all written in block capitals. There were no chapters. Added to my problems, the first time I tried to read his transcript, my knowledge of Italian was not good enough. Also, my father never really spoke of his wartime experiences when growing up. And knowing what I know now about them, I can well understand why. It would have been a very difficult conversation to have started with a child. It did mean, however, that when I came to read and subsequently translate the transcript, I did not have any points of references. In fact, it wasn't until the year 2000, when my father died, that I actually got my hands on a copy of the transcript. I tried reading it, but there was a point very early on which I found to be incomprehensible, so I simply gave up. And this is how things stood until this man came along. And we all know what happened next.
Anche Cucuretto e giunge a Facchetti. Benetti. Causio. Dribbling di Causio a favore di Benetti. Cross di Benetti. Bettega 2-0. Velocissima, splendida l'azione di contropiede.
That last clip has absolutely nothing to do with our presentation today, but I wanted to show you something a bit uplifting after the depressing slide prior to that. Thinking about it though, there is a tenuous, indeed tortuous link with my time at Geneva with that last clip. I well remember describing that goal in French for my French teacher, Betty James, in an essay I attempted at Geneva. And I still remember her comments when she handed my efforts back to me. Quite exciting. Quite exciting. Either that comment betrayed my lack of application, aptitude, skill in the French language, or it betrayed Betty James's lack of appreciation of the beautiful game. Anyway, what was known of my father's wartime experience was used by a pro-EU campaign group as part of a campaign, and it rekindled an interest in me in the book or the transcript. At the same time, I was advised by someone to ignore the bit I couldn't read or couldn't understand and read on. I did, and I was mortified and horrified by what I read. In 2022, it would have been my father's 100th birthday had he been alive. And I thought it would be a nice idea if we could have the book translated into English and printed as a book for his family, but particularly for his grandchildren, two of whom had never met him. I knew someone I knew who had an academic knowledge of Italian. I asked if he would take on the job of translating the book. He agreed, but found that he couldn't carry on. And having taken on the role myself subsequently, I can well understand why. Because when translating something, I found that it's different, rather different to reading it, because you actually live the story. And I don't mind telling you, I had nightmares. But as I say, time was pressing, and I decided to take on the role of translating the transcript myself. And I'm happy to say that we were able to get it all done and printed in time for his 100th birthday, which would have been the 21st of April, 2022. Now, I feel I'm amongst friends here today, and what I'm about to tell you now will not go beyond, will not be spread by you. Without Brexit, it's unlikely I would have read the transcript. Without Brexit, it's unlikely the transcript would have been translated into a book. Without Brexit, it's unlikely I would be giving this presentation. So I admit it, there was a Brexit benefit. Sorry, I've skipped that slide here, but I'll leave that on because I've made a slight error and I'm not quite sure how I get back. Anyway, the next part of my presentation is about a particular word I had an issue with, and this is the word, it's paesano. And I've chosen this word because it throws a light on a couple of things. Firstly, it throws a light on how the north-south divide in Italy, as it was in my father's time and as it is now, and it throws a light on my father's particular use of word. So the north-south divide in Italy is particularly marked, and it was in my father's time, and it's a theme that runs through the book, and it's such people feel so different from the north and the south that they often refer to themselves as being from different countries. And my father referred to that throughout his transcript, and he also remarked or commented on how the northerners looked down on southerners and were disparaging of them. So I'd ask you to bear that in mind when, particularly the fact that people regard themselves as respectively coming from different parts of the country, different countries. When I ask you to bear in mind how I resolved an issue I had with this word paesano, or as my father would have pronounced it, coming from the south, paisan. It literally means fellow countryman, but my father could not have meant that when he used it to describe someone called Giovanni Ferrandino, because it would have been a given that my father was referring to a fellow Italian, because Giovanni was in the Navy like him. When my father used the word, however, it had a different meaning depending on its context. So for my father, a paisan can be someone from the same street, someone from the same village, someone from the same town, someone from the same district, someone from the same region, someone from the same city, or someone from the south as opposed to the north, and the north opposed to the south. So to give you some examples, my friend Andrew lives in Sketty, as do I, so my father's used to the word. He could be my paisan. My friend Jeff, however, lives in the uplands. So in that context, it couldn't be my paisan. But Jeff was brought up in Mount Pleasant like myself, and in that context, he could be my paisan. Jeff, myself, and Andrew could be paisan because we all come from Swansea. My friend, Big Dave, who's no longer with us now, sadly, was English and lived in England, but in the context of England and Wales, he could have been my paisan. Even my old mucker, Paul Wacko Jacko Jackson, could be my paisan in the context of Wales. Even though, and for those of a delicate disposition, I'd ask you to cover yours now, he is from Cardiff. So you can understand my dilemma when my father described Giovanni Ferrandino as a paisan without any context. And so taking into account the north-south divide and playing a bit of a numbers game, I plumbed for fellow southerner. It turned out, however, I was wrong. This is a picture of my father's class when he was aged about 10. And I rediscovered a letter my father had written in which he had described, he named all the people in the class, all the boys in the class he could remember. And lo and behold, here's Giovanni Ferrandino. He's the boy you can see sitting in the middle of the three boys there. So my father was literally describing someone who was certainly from the same island as him and may have been from the same village as him. So in subsequent editions of the book, I've translated him as fellow Ischietan. As a matter of interest, This is my father. He's the boy sitting to the left of the boy with the glasses. Just a note on place names. My father, there are several place names in the transcript that I cannot find. And we have to remember that my father was writing his memories 40 years after the event, so he may not have had a clear memory of that detail. So also, he may not have known where he was at any particular time. He was transported about, and as I say, he wouldn't necessarily be told where he was. Even if he saw it written down, it may have been written in the Cyrillic alphabet. So in the translation, I've stuck to his spelling of place names. After all, it's his story. And similarly with a timeline, I've not tried to fit in his particular timeline with the historical chronology of what was going on, because he may not have heard of world events at all, or may not have heard of them at the time. There may have been some time lag. So, as I've said, I've not tried to synchronize them. After all, it is his story. And, and now for that story. Spoiler alert, he survived. His account begins with his recalling his early life on Ischia. And it's about that point in the book that I originally I reached my roadblock. So you can see it was very early on. Anyway, my father says that there was no real jobs open for him other than to join the military, and so he joined the Navy, and he trained as a naval gunner. War breaks out, and my grandfather is sent to Tirana, as I've said, as some sort of civilian administrator. And he wangles it, so he gets my father transferred to an army mobile unit in Tirana as a bookkeeper, an assistant bookkeeper, or an accountant at the army mobile unit, at an army mobile unit. And these are a few photos that I've recently been given by my cousin in Ischia, recently on a trip there. And this is a photograph which I believe is of my grandfather in his office in Tirana. As you can see, the man sitting on the desk is wearing a military uniform. And this is another photograph of the same office. I think this is my grandfather sitting there. And as you can see, there's a military man sitting behind him. This next photo, I believe, is also Tirana. And has my grandfather, who's the man in the middle, my father, who's the man standing to his right, our left, and my uncle Zio Nicola, is the man you can see wearing the white trousers. And this is a photograph of my grandfather and my father doing their laundry at the army mobile unit. And here we have a photograph of the pass that my father used to get on and off the army mobile unit. And I think it's significant that my father's actually in civilian clothing. Anyway, as my father puts it, the Navy catch up with him, they find out where he is and order him to the gun emplacement at Valona or Valles. In the meantime, my grandfather gets the rest of the family transferred over to Tirana. And my father regularly travels from Valles or Valona to Tirana. And you get a feeling in this part of the book that my father's just lapping up life as a young man. For instance, he visits a mosque in Tirana just to see what it's like. These are a couple of shots of my father in naval uniform in Albania. The first shot is in Tirana in 1943, and the second one is in Valona or Valles. And as you can see in that second shot, he's actually carrying a rifle. Anyway, as I say, on the 8th of September 1943, Italy capitulated, and things changed dramatically. Firstly, the Germans at the gun battery are put under arrest by the Italians there. But not long after, a fascist black shirt officer in the army, so he would be a political officer, comes along and orders the release of the German prisoners, whereupon my father's put under arrest because he does not agree to throw his lot in with the Germans. This doesn't stop them, however, arming himself and the other Italians put under arrest when they come under attack from the partisans. Anyway, my father's concerned about my grandfather, who's by this time alone in Tirana, and here his sense of family propels him to make a decision. And the decision is to escape and to join my grandfather in Tirana and help him if he can. And with the help of a local man called Gori, an Albanian, he does escape. There are a couple of things to point out here now. Firstly, had my father not escaped, it's more likely than not he would have been repatriated. Naval personnel tended to be repatriated, and if you think about it logically, naval personnel tended to be stationed on the coast, and they would be amongst the first that would have been repatriated by the Navy. And to underline that fact, when my father was eventually repatriated, in 1946, he was repatriated 2,000 fellow Italians, of whom only 13, including him, were from the Navy. And the second thing to point out here is that Gori, who's an Albanian, is a friend of my father. As I said, he helped my father escape. And as an Albanian, he would have been taking a grave risk, maybe even risking being executed for doing so. And my father was able to make these connections with people. And he'd obviously made such a connection with Gori. And this happens time and time again throughout my father's account. He makes connections with people, and which literally gets him out of life and death situations. After the fall of communism, my father went back to Albania to find his friend Gori, and he did find him. And this is a photo of my father and Gori when they were reunited. And I believe this is Gori's house. And he has a very special taste in furniture, as you can see. Anyway, my father escapes from the gun emplacement, as I said, and Gori gives him some civilian clothing to wear. But my father, for some reason, which he doesn't explain, decides to keep on to his hold of his naval kerchief, collar, and lanyard. And this decision would help him save his life later on. And here is a picture which gives us a better view of the kerchief, lanyard, and collar. So as I say, my father decides he's going to go to Tirana, and he simply starts walking to Tirana. And on the road to Tirana, the road is lined with refugees and people, various peoples. And my father notices, however, that people are being stopped by checkpoints, and Italians, if they're identified, are being rounded up. So he decides it's safer to get off the road, and he makes his way through the undergrowth, through the foliage. And this is where he comes across his first horrific sight of the war. He finds 2 Carabinieri soldiers who have been nailed to a tree. They've been skinned alive and castrated. One was dead, the other was near death. There was nothing my father could do for either of them, not even bury them. So he continued on his journey. And that is until he comes across a group of partisans, and he's extremely frightened because he believes it's their handiwork he's just witnessed. But again, he's able to make connections with people. The leader of this group is an Albanian, but used to be in the Italian army, so he spoke perfect Italian. And my father was able to convince him that actually he had deserted, not from the army, which would have put him in better stead, but from the Navy. Rather, being from the Navy would put him in better stead. And he could prove he was from the Navy because he had his lanyard, kerchief, and collar with him. And he told them that he was actually deserted to find an anti-fascist partisan group to join. And he even managed to convince them that his father was actually in prison in Italy for his anti-fascist views. So they accept his story and they take them to his village, to their village, which is a base for the partisans, but also there are many Italian military personnel there. The partisans are after a pro-fascist partisan leader called Issa Tosca, and he has a group based in a partisan group, pro-fascist partisan group based in a place called Fieri. So they march to Fieri, and there a battle takes place, and they manage to enter the town. They find Issa Tosca, they kill him, partisans kill him and decapitate him and put his head on a pole which is paraded around the town. And then my father says the carnage began because they began executing all their prisoners. As a matter of interest, my father had a scar on his left cheek, which he once told me was from a hand grenade. He was specific, it was from a hand grenade. And I believe this is the most likely place that he obtained that wound. Anyway, my father decides that if he stays with these people, he's going to end up dead. And in any event, he still wants to get to Tirana. So he decides he's going to escape. He notices that there are trucks being loaded with booty from the town, and so he loads up. So he decides to jump in the back of one of these trucks. He sneaks into the back of one. He hides under some boxes and sacking, and simply waits to be driven out of Fieri. When the truck stops for a break on the road, he simply slips out of the truck and he joins the procession of refugees or civilians making their way to a place called Duruzzo. When he gets to Duruzzo, he finds it's a sea of calm in an ocean of madness. There had been a battle there between Italian Marines and the Germans have been driven out of Duruzzo, and Duruzzo was firmly under Italian control. And it's here he meets his paesano Giovanni Ferrandino. He asks, Giovanni tells him that Tirana is firmly under German control. My father's still determined to get to Tirana, and he asks Giovanni to come with him. And Giovanni wisely decides not to join him. And I always find this part of the story quite bizarre, because my father then is able to catch a coach to Tirana. So he arrives at Tirana, and he spends the next 3 days and nights looking for my grandfather, and he can't find him anywhere. He's getting desperate now because he's run out of food, he's got no money, and he's got nowhere to live. He then comes across a work colleague of my grandfather who tells my father that my grandfather's being given shelter at the house of an Albanian woman who's protecting Italians. Now, Italians are being routinely attacked and killed in Tirana, and this Albanian woman is sheltering them from such attacks. So my father makes his way to this house, and there he finds my grandfather. He's asleep in his bedroom, which is a balcony with a curtain across it. And there he joins my grandfather. That is until partisans come to the house one day and they tell the Albanian lady, who my father doesn't name, that she's got to evict all the Italians living in her house, which she does. So my grandfather and my father are now homeless. They hear about, however, some villas or houses that abut a military airfield which have been vacated. They used to be occupied by military personnel, and they decide to take up residence in one of these. And the arrangement they've got here is that my father stays home throughout the day and my grandfather goes out to work. He's found work with a wine merchant. Of course, they've got to eat, so someone's got to earn money. Now, the reason they decide my father should stay at home is because it's too dangerous of Italian men of his age to be abroad in Tirana. My father recounts how he could hear executions daily taking place in the cemetery near his house, and he talks about bodies being strung up all over Tirana. Anyway, that's the arrangement they've got until one day one night, my grandfather doesn't return home from work as per normal. My father, of course, is extremely worried, but he doesn't break the curfew. But as soon as he can, the next morning, he goes out looking for him. And he's so desperate, in fact, that he goes into a German military police station to see if he can get help. Now, they don't arrest him. Again, he's able to make connections with these people, and they suggest that he tries the hospital. So my father goes to the hospital and finds that the guards there won't let him in. There are guards on the gate. So he then remembers a friend of the family called Sally. Now, Sally is an Albanian who is actually in the Italian military. He is an Italian military policeman, and but he's thrown his lot in with the Germans, so he's working with the Germans. So my father goes to find Sally. Sally comes to the hospital, gets him into the hospital, and there they found my grandfather. He'd been knocked over the night before by a German truck, and his leg had been broken. So Sally arranges my grandfather's discharge from the hospital, and also arranges for a car to take my grandfather home. Now, I've recently discovered the notation on the back of this photograph. I had taken it out of an album. I didn't realize there was a notation on it. And the notation refers to the picture containing, the picture has Sally in it. Now, Sally is identified as one of the two men you can see in the background there. But it's not clear which one it is. I have a feeling it's the one wearing the jacket, because Sally was a maresciallo. Now, a maresciallo would have in the military police would have a rank of a corporal, and I believe that the man you can see in the jacket is carrying the insignia of a corporal. As a matter of interest, the two girls you can see in the photograph are my aunts, Zia Felina, who's the one furthest back, and Zia Mary, who's the one you can see in the foreground there. She was called Mary and not Maria. She was named after a Welsh woman, but that is another story. Anyway, the arrangement now is that my grandfather can't go out to work because he's got a broken leg. So they decide that my father, despite the risks, should go out to work. So he goes to work every day, and my grandfather is recuperating at home. One day, however, there's an air raid, and they've come for my father realizes they've come for the airfield, because the airfield is still being used as a base to attack the south of Italy, by which time has Allied troops there. So, and as my father puts it in his account, they've come there to teach them a lesson. My father rushes home and literally carries my grandfather out of the house on his back as bombs drop around them. When they return after the raid, they found the house has been partially demolished, but it's still habitable. The next problem, however, is that the Germans decide to issue a proclamation, and the proclamation says that all Italian males have to present themselves to the Germans within the next 10 days. If they don't, and if they're found after that, they will be automatically conscripted into the German army. Now, my father and my grandfather decided there's nothing left for them to do other than to give themselves up. The Germans are desperate to get all the Italian males rounded up. So they decide to give themselves up. They're not interested in my grandfather because of his age. However, they put my father in prison, and the prison rapidly fills up with other Italian men of his age. They're being fed, but the rations are meager. Initially, they allow those rations to be buttressed by food brought in from outside by friends and relatives. But then the Germans stopped this. And obviously there's a plan going on here, because not long after, an Italian major comes to them, and he explained to them that the Duce, in his puppet state in the north of Italy, is forming a new army, and he's looking for volunteers for the army. And he invites the men in the prison to volunteer for the Duce's new army. They believe they've got no other option other than to volunteer. And they may also have been thinking that because they're told that they'll be taken back to the Duce's state for training, which is in the north of Italy, they may also be thinking there's a better chance of escaping there. And certainly if they escape from there, they'll be on home territory. So my father and his comrades volunteer. The Germans decide they want to take them to the state by train, but there are no railways in Albania. So they take them out of Albania by truck, and they travel across the mountains from a place called Santa Maria to Cooks, the Italians, escorted by the Germans. And my father describes the mountain track being no wider than a mule track, and it's lined with scores and scores of Italian soldiers. And he said most of them looked like they were near death. They then get to a railway head where they're put into cattle trucks, and the train takes them to a camp called Kosaka Mitrovica. And this was a concentration camp of Italians from all over the Balkans and Greece. My father and the volunteers, however, are not treated as prisoners. They're put in a separate place. They're still, however, left for a week without food, and their toilet was a cut-down petrol can. My father says they were being treated well as compared to the prisoners. And it's at this point in my father's narrative that he calls out the behaviour of a guard, and he only does this on 2 occasions. Further on in the narrative, he mentions a guard called Mirko, who's a Yugoslav, who my father describes as a good, kind man. On this occasion, the person he mentions is someone called Bentivoglio. Now, Bentivoglio is an Italian. He's from the Tyrol in the north of Italy, and he's actually a guard at the camp. And my father says that Bentivoglio would carry a lump of wood round with him and would randomly beat up men for no reason whatsoever and carry on beating them even as they lay unconscious on the ground. My father described him in his transcript as being truly evil. And considering all the bad men my father encountered during this period, that must be considered some sort of accolade. My father and the volunteers are eventually visited by a German colonel. He tells them that they're not going to now be sent to Mussolini, to his puppet state. They were not going to Italy. They were now going to be volunteered into the German army. And as such, they were all sent for training. And this is where they meet French, Ukrainians, Greeks, Serbs, Croats, even English and Northern Irish, all being trained to be part of the German army. After training, my father's company's role is not for offensive duties. They're simply guard duties and guard and escort duties. However, on one occasion, they're asked to guard the Italian prisoners. And there's a lot of disquiet amongst my father and his comrades about this. Not long after, my father was amongst 35 men who were ordered to the commandant's office, where they're put under arrest. They're ordered to strip their uniforms. They're given rags and wooden shoes to wear, and they're put in the camp which they've just been asked to guard. Clearly, there was a spy amongst them. My father was then taken to a place called Kaisersteinbruck, which is in Austria. They were crammed in cattle trucks, travelling for 3 days and nights. They were not given any food nor water. They were not allowed off the train to go to the toilet, and there were no toilet facilities, obviously, on the train. They were told that as they were not being fed or watered, then they should not need to use the toilet. My father leaves it to the imagination of the person reading the book, his transcript, to set out the state of the men and the carriages at the end of that journey. He said practically everyone suffered from dysentery. Kaisersteinbruck had 6,000 prisoners of war of various nationalities. And here my father particularly recalls the harshness of the roll calls, where men weakened by ill health, lack of food, wounds, were made to stand in the bitter cold, wind, rain and snow, in the freezing temperatures, for literally hours at a time, for no reason other than the pleasure of the duty officer. Each day men were allotted jobs. Those remaining in camp were not allowed back into the barracks because of the extreme conditions, this could mean a sentence of death. Men literally broke down if they were not allotted work, and often these men were carted off and never seen again. One day, my father specially selected with 200 of his fittest comrades. As I've said before, one of the attributes my father has was his physical fitness. And his physical fitness bore out despite all his deprivation, and his physical fitness on this occasion worked to his benefit, because the men that had been selected were taken to a railway head where they find a train waiting for them. The train is fitted with bunks, kitchens, showers and toilets. The train is going to be used as a mobile repair unit, and the object is to travel all over the Balkans and beyond to repair railway lines that have been damaged by the partisans or by the Allies. My father says the work was extremely hard, but the food was much better and the conditions were much better. And also there was the opportunity of stealing, pilfering from passing trains, provided what you took you also shared with the guards. So, as I said, on this occasion, my father's fitness worked to his advantage. He was able to get better conditions, which enhanced his chance of survival. And as I said, my father travelled all over the Balkans and beyond during this period, even going into Germany and Hungary. The next significant event was when my father is again in another air raid. This time it's much more devastating than the first air raid. His train had pulled into a railway station where there were mustered other trains. These trains contained troops and munitions. Whether the Allies knew about the mustering of these trains is open to conjecture, but they'd certainly come well prepared to inflict the maximum damage that they could. My father eventually finds shelter in a cornfield, and when he returns after the raid had finished, there's a scene of utter devastation. The train, their engine was in pieces, small pieces everywhere, had been totally destroyed. The only bit of it left in one piece was a railway carriage, which was actually perched on the roof of a building. And this, in fact, is probably the most descriptive part of my father's transcript, and also one of the most difficult to translate. Obviously, even after 40 years, it remained a vivid memory for him. Anyway, they returned to where the train was. They're not sure what to do, and eventually a German military patrol comes by and orders them to start clearing the area and clearing the dead bodies. And my father records that they cleared a lot of dead Germans that day. The police then arranged for them to be returned back to the camp at Kosacha Mitrovica. It's now November 1944. The Germans are in retreat everywhere. One morning, my father and his fellow prisoners wake up to find the guards have disappeared. Was this the beginning of the end for them? Were they all now going to be going home? It wasn't going to be the case. My father would not return home for another 2 years. Initially, they stay in the camp because they don't know what to do. That is until the camp is bombed by an Allied plane. So they decide it's safer to hide in the mountains. So up the mountains they go, and then they hear that the area has been liberated by partisans and also the Bulgarian army. So they decide to come down from the mountain and surrender themselves. And when they come down, they're divided into two groups, one for the partisans and one for the Bulgarian army. Unfortunately for my father, he ended up with the partisans. They beat them, then they rob them, and then they decide they're just going to execute them. Fortunately for my father, the Bulgarian army got wind of this and they came to their rescue. So now they were in the hands of the Bulgarian army, but it was still the problem what to do with them. So the Bulgarians decide they're going to send them back to their capital, Sofia. But to get to Sofia, they want to put them on a train. And the nearest train is 200 kilometers away at a place called Nice. So they decide that the Italians are to march to Nice. My father relates that the march was an ordeal because they were weak from lack of food, some of them were wounded. There were ill men amongst them. He said, however, the Bulgarians were very kind to them. They let them march at their own pace, and they gave them a nice piece of bread every day to eat. On arriving at Niš, the first problem they encounter is that the only train engine there is damaged. They, however, quickly repair that. The second problem is that there are not enough carriages for everyone. And here my father's physical fitness worked against him, because it's decided that the weak, the injured, the ill should be given priority. So they occupy all the carriages, and my father, being fit, is left behind. So the men left behind, they're not sure what to do. Eventually, a partisan patrol turns up, and they tell them that Italians are still being repatriated from a place called Salonika, which is in Greece. These partisans were going to Skopje, which was on the way to Salonika, and they said they could march with them to Skopje. My father relates as some 2,000 Italians marched with the partisans to Skopje. When they get to Skopje, the partisans take them to a disused barracks and simply leave them there. They're left with no food, no direction, they don't know what to do. They're so hungry, they are rooting around in the old stables of these barracks. They find some old beans there, and even after cooking, these beans are too hard. They won't soften, but as I said, they're so hungry, they eat them as they are. Eventually, a partisan official turns up, and he's accompanied by 50 armed men. They're informed that they're not now going to be sent home. They're to remain in Yugoslavia until such time as all the damage caused by the Italians there is repaired. And in order to ensure that they are repatriated, they would have to satisfy the Yugoslavians that they've worked hard enough. As you can imagine, my father and his comrades are devastated. My father is selected after a few hours and taken to a village which is on the railway to Salonika, and they're ordered to repair the railway, but the ground is literally frozen and they can't do any work there. The Yugoslavs believe they're shirking, and so began beating them. Eventually they managed to persuade the Yugoslavs that they could do other maintenance work there. But this would prove to be the mindset of the Yugoslavs that my father will have to endure for the next 2 years. A year went by as they constructed a 3-kilometre section of railway. Then they were on the move again. Packed in trucks once more, they were disembarked at a place my father believed was called Tetova. They were made to march up a mountain. The going was tough because the snow was so soft. It was extremely cold. It was night time. They were literally followed by a pack of wolves, and if any man fell behind, they were simply left. They eventually arrived at a mountain village which my father believed was in Montenegro. They had no food, no supplies, and they did not eat for the next 8 days. The Yugoslav commander decided to send a patrol out to the next village, which my father names as Pritsin. Now, the only Pritsin I can find is actually in Kosovo. And for reasons I come on to later, I believe my father wasn't in Montenegro. He was in Kosovo. Anyway, the patrol goes to Pritsin. It returns with food, but also saws and axes. Their job here is to cut down the trees. My father is clearly in awe of these trees. They're huge, they're magnificent, oaks and beeches. And their job, as I say, is to cut down the trees. They then have to strip the trees, and the logs are rolled down the mountainside. And this is extremely dangerous because often men got caught by the logs as they tumbled down the mountainside. And he describes how one man had his leg smashed and he was simply carted off and never seen again. My father decided the only way he was ever going to get home was to escape, and he came up with a plan, and the plan was extremely simple. He was going to walk across the mountains to Albania. He decided he needed someone to go with him. And he chose Rossi. Now, Rossi was a surprising choice for my father because Rossi was a northerner. But there are reasons why he chose Rossi, which he explains in his in his account. Anyway, and Rossi, I should say, is someone who's also been disparaging of Southerners, and that's something to bear in mind later on. One moonless night, Rossi and my father simply walked out of camp, out of the barracks. There were no guards because the Yugoslavs thought that the weather conditions were so bad there that no one would be mad enough to try and escape. Rossi and my father found the going extremely tough. There had been a fresh layer of snow. It began snowing and raining. Rossi began complaining, saying that he should never have listened to my father and come with him. He was slowing them down. As I said, Rossi had always been disparaging of Southerners, running them down as lacking character. Now it was he, my father noted, who was lacking character. Morning comes, and they have not even walked 10 kilometers. Stretching below them, they can see various villages, and they decide to go to one for help. They enter the village, and they're taken to the priest. The priest, who could speak perfect Italian because he'd been stationed or based in Italy at some point. They speak to the priest, and they tell the priest who they are and what they're up to, and the priest tells them they're mad. He said the conditions are so bad at that time of year that not even locals would try to traverse the mountains. In any event, he says there's a war going on there, and the war is between the Albanians and the Serbian or the Yugoslav partisans because the region's in dispute. And that's why I think it was Kosovo, because it's still an area of dispute today between the Albanians and the Serbians. Anyway, the priest asked my father if he could help a villager who has problems with his feet. He has pain in his feet. So my father says he will do what he can. So my father and Rossi take him to the villager, and they massage. My father massages his feet, which alleviates the pain. The family are extremely grateful, and they give my father and Rossi some food. Now, neither my father nor Rossi would ever get to eat this food, but it did in fact save their lives. The family also tell my father and Rossi that the other villagers had gone to the camp, the Yugoslav partisan camp, to tell them that they were there. Now, the reason they'd done this is that they'd suffered at the hands of the partisans before, and they were afraid of reprisals if they were found there. So my father and Rossi decide there's nothing for it other than to return to camp. Miserably, they make their way back. On their way there, they're met by a patrol. They're then put under arrest and marched and walked back to camp. On the way there, my father firmly believes he's going to be executed, and Rossi does as well. When they get to the camp, my father and Rossi are taken to the camp commander. And here again, my father's able to make connection with the man. And this time he does it through an interpreter. And he tells the camp commander that they actually weren't trying to escape. What they were trying to do was actually find food. And they'd gone to the village to scrounge food. And they could prove that because when they were found, they had food on them. Their story is confirmed, and the camp commander accepts their story, but he decides they still have to be punished. So Rossi and my father are separated. My father's taken to a basement which literally has no windows in it. It's completely dark in there. It's stinking dirty. There's nowhere to sleep in there. He's locked in there for 3 weeks, and when he's eventually released, he's temporarily blind. The prisoners were on the move again. They were taken to a place called Valles, which my father recalls was renamed Titograd. From there, they're taken to the banks of the Vardar River, the nearest village being called Demirkapia. There was no camp there for them, so they slept out in the open. That is until the prisoners themselves built shelters out of trees and mud. It's at this point of the account that my father begins speaking of 4 other men with whom he had close friendships, and they with him. He has especially warm words for a man called Vincenzo Festa. Now, Festa was older than the other men. He was a man in his 30s, Most of the other men were in their late teens or 20s. Festa became like a father figure to the men. He was always finding the right words for them when they felt at their lowest. And he was trusted with working out a way of sharing their daily ration of bread. Each man was given they were given a loaf of bread each day, a kilo of bread, which was meant to be shared between 10 men. And obviously, as you can appreciate, it was really important that it was shared fairly, and at the very least to be seen to be shared fairly. And as I say, Festa was the man trusted to do this. I decided to dedicate to my father and these men. One of the last things I remember my father telling me before he died is that he heard news from Italy that the last of my father's friends had died. It really shook him up. He related to me as how they'd shed blankets when they were prisoners of war, and it was not long after that he passed also. My father's role here at this site, together with his comrades, was excavating a mountain to build a tunnel through it. The prisoners were expected to attend political re-education classes. My father found it particularly galling that whilst they were preaching equality under communism to them, they would be treated as slaves. He describes how prisoners routinely punished, even for the slightest of infractions, and even if you were thought or deemed not to be working hard enough. The most cruel of these punishments was something called the galinaio. Now, the galinaio was a small cage open to the elements. Prisoners were placed in this small cage overnight, without food. You had to rely on your comrades to bring food to you. The length you were still expected to put a full day's work in the following day. The length of your stay was determined by the guard administering the punishment. My father relates how one man spent 3 months in there. My father himself spent 2 weeks in there. He doesn't explain why he was put in there. He says nothing of his experience in there. I can only imagine that even that was too traumatic to put to paper. The Yugoslavs complained that progress on the tunnel was too slow. Despite the weakness, dysentery and malaria, each man was expected to fill 15 cartloads of earth each day. Then the Yugoslavs came up with a plan, or a trap as my father puts it. They told the prisoners that if they finished their quota of 15, individual quota of 15, before the end of the day, then they could have the rest of the day off. Men began filling their quota of 15 in half a day, and for the first 2 days, the Yugoslavs were true to their word, and the men had the rest of the day off. On the third day, however, they informed the men that as men had been completing cartloads of 15 in half a day, then the quota was going up to 30 cartloads a day for each man. The men were outraged. They refused to go to work. They were beaten, and they still refused to go to work. They were threatened with execution, and they still refused to go to work. The Yugoslavs then selected 20 hostages, and they told them that these men would be shot unless all the men returned to work. Despite the protestations of the hostages who said they were willing to die, the men decided to return to work. The Yugoslavs told them that before they could return to camp and rest that evening, each man had to complete 20 cartloads of earth. And my father says, in an act of solidarity, which made him want to cry every time he thought about it, each man helped the other complete their individual 20 cartloads of earth. My father decided to make another escape attempt. He decided he was never going to get home unless he took matters into his own hands. And again, he came up with a simple plan. He determined that the Vardar River flowed into Greece, and his plan was simply to float down the river until he reached Greece and get out. He took the extreme risk of cutting a piece of canvas from a guard's tent. and he was to use this to keep his clothes dry when he got in the river. One day, at the end of his shift, instead of rejoining his comrades, he hid in some bushes. When night fell, he stripped, put his clothes in the canvas that he cut from the tent, and slipped into the river. It was freezing cold, far colder than he expected it to be. It was far too cold for him. He knew that if he stayed in there, he was not going to survive. He also knew he didn't have the strength to navigate the river. He didn't have the strength to get out, because when he was trying to get out, he simply was not able to. He was so desperate that he even shouted for help. Of course, no one heard him. Eventually, the river itself threw him out as it went round a bend. He miserably got out and started making his way back to camp. He seriously thought of throwing himself back in the river and ending it all. Then he could see a campfire ahead of him. He joined the campfire where there were two locals. He told them who he was, and what he'd been trying to do. They thought he was completely crazy. They gave him something to drink, some alcohol to drink, but then they asked him to leave the camp as they did not want to be implicated in his escape attempt. When he left them, he came up with another plan. He would return to the point where he'd left his work detail, in the hope that the same detail would be returned to that point the following morning, and he would simply join the detail from the bushes. And that's what happened. The following morning, the detail turned up, he joined them. Unusually that morning, there was a roll call. And of course, my father was counted in. He was told that unusually there had been 2 roll calls the previous evening. Obviously, the 2 men at the campsite had gone straight back to the partisans and told them there was a man on the loose. And obviously, the Yugoslavs couldn't count. He had not been discovered, or had he? Not long after, my father was summoned to the commandant's office, and he feared the worst, especially when a political officer there began questioning him about his swimming skills. However, it turned out that there was a raft ferry on the river which had come adrift from its steel cable, the steel awning, and after a storm, and they needed someone to refloat the ferry. And here my father's swimming skills, and indeed the skills he'd learned at the harbour at Ischia, came into play. He managed to refloat the ferry, and afterwards they asked him to run the ferry, so he became the ferryman. This meant he could come and go as he pleased to the camp, and also he was given food and clothes by the locals who christened him Branco. Of course, he had to share his food with the camp commander, and he shared what he had with with his comrades at the camp. It's about this time my father also received his one and only letter from home. And he was one of the few men to receive a letter, and it became something of camp property even after, especially among the Southerners. And I discovered something about my grandfather when I located this letter in my father's effects, that my grandfather's handwriting is actually worse than mine. My father's life as a ferryman came to an abrupt stop after a storm, when the ferry was once again ripped from its steel moorings, and at this time there was no repairing it. Some 2 years had gone by, and my father was on the move again. They were taken to a place my father called Brisko in Bosnia, and they were told they were going there to build a railway, packed again in cattle trucks with no toilets and no food arranged for them. When they get there, although they're built in an old army barracks, which has mattresses and showers, my father said the cold there was unbearable. The food improved, however, but that in itself posed a health risk to these men. Their bodies could not cope with the good food, and a lot of men were taken ill. Some even died. They in fact found the railway they'd come to construct had already been built, but they were taken each day to the railway to do finishing work. And there my father was astounded to find young Italian communists who had volunteered from Italy to come there and build the railway. It was they who had built the railway. They had no truck at all with the Italian prisoners of war, who they all regarded to be fascists. My father faced another grim winter in the hands of the partisans, with seemingly no hope of ever returning home. One morning, however, at roll call, they were informed that they were to be released. An agreement had been reached between the Italian communists and Tito, the communist leader of Yugoslavia, securing their release, in the hope that this would aid the Italian Communist Party in the up-and-coming elections. They were put on a train to Ragusa, or Dubrovnik as it's called now. They actually sat in seats. A ship had been sent from Italy to collect them. But there was not enough room for them all on the ship, so lots were drawn. And fortunately, my father's name was drawn, so he was going home. The men left behind would have to wait another 8 months before another ship was found for them. The final humiliation, however, was to come. They were told that as they marched to the port, they had to carry placards praising their captors. They knew that if they did not do this, they would not be going home. They knew also that if they did not do this, the men coming behind them would not be coming home. As my father carried his placard to the port, he begged forgiveness from all the men left behind in their graves. When they docked at Ancona, there were members of various political parties waiting, each with gifts of food and clothing. My father was amazed to see so many political parties. All his life there had only been one. They were then put on a train for Bari. At Bari, naval personnel were separated and put on another train to Taranto. At Taranto, even though it was the middle of the night, a naval guard of honour and a naval band was there to greet them. They were taken to the naval barracks where they spent the night. The next day, my father was given a medical inspection, was deemed fit, given a new uniform, 1,000 lira, a train pass to Naples, 2 months furlough, and an honourable discharge. He thought he was rich until he got to the railway station and found that a sandwich cost 500 lira. When he got to Naples, he went straight to the docks. He was desperate to get home, but he found there was no ferries until later that day. He was unwilling to wait. He caught a train to a place called Pozzuoli, hoping to catch a lift home, knowing that ships from Ischia often docked there. When a guard checked his pass on the train, he told him the pass did not cover this leg of the journey and demanded payment from him. Something my father snapped. He refused to pay him. He told the guard where he'd been and what he'd been through. The guard refused to relent and still demanded payment. Other passengers took my father's cause, and the guard said that he would not take payment from him, but he wanted my father's name and address because he was going to send him a bill that covered that leg of the journey. In 1988, when my father set down his memoir, he said he was still waiting for that bill. Arriving at the port, my father spotted an old friend of his who was gobsmacked to see him. Everyone thought he was dead. He sailed him home. Normally, ships entering the port of Ischia take the right channel. My father's house was on the left of the port as you go in. Despite this convention, my father's friend took the left channel going in the hope that some of my father's family would be on their balcony and would see my father as he came into port. They weren't. A ship embarked. My father disembarked. He went home, found his mother, his 2 sisters, and his brother there. My grandfather was at the next village. A car was sent to get him. It was Christmas 1946. I mentioned at the outset all the characteristics, features and traits that in one way or another impacted my father during his wartime experience. I think I've touched upon all of them, except perhaps his pride. I said he was a proud man. I was wrong. He was actually an extremely proud man. And I know he would have found it difficult, not only with the fact of his captivity, with him being treated as a slave, but also being dressed in rags all the time, literally lousy with dirt, and not even having the dignity of enough plates to eat off. They had to eat in shifts. He did try and find pride in the things that they did, in things they constructed. And the pride in the construction work was enhanced because of the extreme conditions, arduous conditions in which they worked. He was also proud of the fact that he was able to refloat the ferry and that he was the ferryman. When they docked at Ancona, the naval personnel were ordered to a naval desk where a naval officer was waiting to greet them. My father would have been unrecognizable as a naval man. He nevertheless stood to attention, saluted, gave his full name, rank and serial number. He'd held on to a bit of his pride even until the end. I also referred to translation issues, and one in particular we went through. But the translation issue I had the most difficulty with was, in fact, the title of the book my father chose, L'età più bella negli anni più tristi. It literally means the most beautiful age in the saddest of years. What, I thought to myself, could be described as beautiful in any of this account? I think, on reflection, however, my father was referring to what should have been the most beautiful age. There is for me a pervading sense of loss throughout the text, loss of that time of your life in your early 20s, when you're on the cusp of everything, where everything seems to have potential. And I think that time is best summed up in these words by the First World War poet W.L. Hodgson. And there were countless things that we must see and do, while blood was high and time still hovered on reluctant wings. We get a sense of this loss when my father is at the naval base on his return. He notes that all the recruits there were only a couple of years younger than him, but he felt like an old man in comparison. I hope the form of words that I've come up with takes into account the words my father used, but also conveys that sense of loss. Thank you all for allowing me to share my father's story with you. And by allowing me to do so, I also thank you because you've become part of my story. If you're interested, you can purchase a copy of my father's memoirs translated from Amazon, either in hardback or on Kindle. You will find they're very reasonably priced at $1.99 for Kindle or $4.85 for a hardback book. Thank you once again for taking the time to listen to me.